Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the cracks in my marriage first began to show, but back then, I didn't notice. Jenna and I had been married for 14 years, and while things weren't always perfect, I thought we had a strong foundation. We had a life together, a teenage daughter, and shared memories that I foolishly believed were enough to keep us going. But looking back now, I can see the signs that everything was beginning to unravel. I remember that day clearly. I had just pulled into the driveway after work, tired but happy to be home. Jenna wasn't there yet, which wasn't unusual. She worked part-time at the university bookstore, and sometimes she stayed late. I didn't think much of it until she started coming home later and later, often with vague excuses. "I lost track of time," she'd say. Or, "I went out for drinks with the girls." I believed her. Why wouldn't I? After all, this was Jenna, my wife, my partner, the woman I had built a life with. But the distance between us kept growing. The dinners we used to share in quiet contentment became brief encounters, hurried meals before she disappeared into the bedroom or claimed she was too tired to talk. I'd find myself sitting alone in the living room, wondering what had changed, trying to shake off the gnawing feeling in my gut that something was wrong. It was the little things at first. She started paying more attention to her phone, always flipping it face down on the table or slipping it into her pocket whenever I walked into the room. When I asked about it, she brushed it off with a laugh. "It's just work stuff," she'd say, and I'd let it go, unwilling to push. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband, always accusing, always suspecting. That's not who I was. That's not who we were. And then, there was George. He had been my best friend since high school, the guy who was always there for me, through thick and thin. He had helped me with everything from car trouble to relationship advice, and I trusted him completely. He was more than just a mechanic, he was like a brother to me. We'd shared countless beers over the years, joked about life, and supported each other through every rough patch. George had even stood by my side on my wedding day, making toasts and promises that I thought were as unshakable as our friendship. The first time I felt something off was during a casual night out. George, Jenna, and I had gone out for dinner, nothing fancy, just the three of us catching up like we often did. I noticed the way they interacted that night, little things that I would have otherwise overlooked. The way their eyes lingered on each other for a moment too long, the way George laughed a little too hard at Jenna's jokes. I chalked it up to my imagination, told myself I was being ridiculous. But that was just the beginning. Weeks passed, and the late nights continued. I buried myself in work, convincing myself that everything was fine. I didn't want to believe that the woman I loved and the man I considered family could betray me. Even when the uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger, I refused to confront it. I tried to stay busy, hoping that things would go back to the way they were. After all, we had been through tough times before. We always made it through. But then came the night at the diner. It was a rainy evening, one of those nights where the clouds hung low and the streets glistened under the glow of streetlights. I had stopped by our local spot to grab a quick bite after a long day at the dealership. The place was quiet, with only a few regulars scattered around the booths. I sat down, ordered my usual, and was halfway through my burger when I overheard a familiar voice from the next booth. At first, I didn't think anything of it. The voice belonged to George, and he was talking to someone I didn't recognize. I was about to call out to him when something stopped me in my tracks. "Yeah, been with her since their wedding day," George said with a chuckle. "Poor bastard has no clue." My heart froze. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him, that maybe it was a joke or some wild exaggeration. But then George continued, his voice casual, as if he were discussing the weather. "We still meet up a couple times a month. She's a real firecracker. Keeps me on my toes." The blood drained from my face, and I felt like I was going to be sick. Jenna. He was talking about Jenna. My wife. My best friend. I sat there, paralyzed, unable to process the words that were coming out of his mouth. How long had this been going on? How could I have been so blind? George's laughter grated in my ears as he bragged about their meetings, about how easy it had been to keep the secret from me. "He's too trusting," George said, and I could practically hear the smug grin in his voice. Good ol' Kurt, always too busy with work to notice what's right under his nose. I wanted to get up, to march over to that booth and knock George's teeth in. I wanted to scream at him, demand answers, make him feel the same betrayal that was coursing through my veins. But instead, I sat there, frozen in shock, as my world shattered around me. I didn't confront them that night. I couldn't. I was too stunned, too numb to react. Instead, I quietly paid my bill and walked out of the diner, my mind spinning with questions, doubts, and anger. How long had this been going on? Was Jenna still lying to me? How could George, the man I trusted with my life, do something like this? The rain poured down as I walked to my car, but I barely noticed. My thoughts were consumed by the betrayal, by the lies that had been unfolding right in front of me for God knows how long. By the time I got home, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't going to be the clueless husband anymore. I wasn't going to confront them yet. I needed proof, something undeniable that I could throw in their faces. Something that would leave no room for excuses or denials. And when I had it, I would make them both pay for what they had done. Revenge, I decided, would be sweet. For the next few days, I played the part of the oblivious husband. I acted like everything was fine, just as I had done before, but now every word, every movement felt like a lie. Jenna came home late again that week, her excuses rehearsed and hollow. Work ran late, she said as she kicked off her shoes. There was a last-minute meeting with a client. I smiled and nodded, pretending to believe her, pretending that everything was as it should be. But inside, I was seething. The rage was always there now, simmering just beneath the surface. I couldn't sleep. Every night, I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about her with George. Imagining them together. It made me sick to my stomach, but I couldn't stop the thoughts from coming. During the day, I kept busy at the dealership. The used car business had been good to me, and I had a small team of trusted employees who could handle the day-to-day. That gave me plenty of time to dig. I started with Jenna's phone, waiting for the right moment to get my hands on it. I knew she kept it locked, but after 14 years of marriage, I also knew her passcode. It was our daughter's birthday, 13th of June, 2007. The opportunity came one night when she took a long shower after another late night at work. I crept into the bedroom, her phone charging on the nightstand. My heart was racing as I picked it up, entered the passcode, and scrolled through her messages. I felt like a fool for not doing this sooner. It was all there, plain as day, texts from George, some of them going back months. George, tonight was amazing. Can't wait for next time. Jenna, you make me feel alive, George. Like I'm free. I scrolled through dozens of messages, each one like a punch to the gut. They'd been meeting up for years. There were messages about the times she told me she was working late, about the trips I thought she was taking with friends. It was all a lie. And here I was, holding the proof in my hand. I couldn't breathe. My head spun as I continued reading, fingers trembling as I tried to take it all in. But what really pushed me over the edge was a photo. It wasn't explicit, just Jenna, sitting on a bed in a hotel room, smiling at the camera. I recognized the room. It was the same place we'd stayed at last year for our anniversary. The same room where she had promised me that we were still strong, still connected, despite the growing distance between us. I put the phone down, hands shaking with fury. My mind raced with thoughts of confrontation, of screaming, of tearing our life apart right then and there. But I held back. As much as I wanted to smash everything to pieces in that moment, I knew I needed more than just her phone. I needed to burn their lives down completely. I started keeping a closer eye on her after that. I tracked her movements, checked her phone whenever I could, and made note of her interactions with George. They were careful, never meeting up near our home, always choosing places where they thought they wouldn't be seen. But I knew the truth now, and every detail only fueled my resolve. While I kept tabs on Jenna, I set my plan for George into motion. He was still my go-to mechanic, still depending on me for work. He didn't know that I knew, and I used that to my advantage. One evening, I stopped by his shop on the pretense of needing my truck looked at. George greeted me with his usual grin, the one I now saw as a mask for the lies he'd been living. "Hey, Kurt. What can I do for you?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag as he came out to meet me. I forced a smile. "Truck's acting up. Thought I'd swing by and see if you could take a look." "Of course, man, anything for you." "Bring it in," George said, completely unaware that I wanted nothing more than to knock his teeth in. As he worked on my truck, I kept the conversation light, talking about the business and the usual stuff we'd always discussed. But inside, I was watching him closely, studying his every move. The way he talked, the way he laughed, none of it was real anymore. All I could see was betrayal. That night, I stayed late at the dealership, working on cutting George out of my business. I had all the contracts laid out, and with a few strokes of a pen, I started to sever every financial tie between us. George had built his entire operation off the work I gave him. Without me, his business would crumble. And I couldn't wait to watch it happen. But it wasn't enough. I wanted to destroy more than just his livelihood. I wanted to make him feel the same pain I was feeling, to leave him with nothing, just like he was doing to me. By the time I got home, it was late, and Jenna was already in bed. I stared at her as she slept, her face peaceful and serene, like she wasn't ripping our lives apart. How could she sleep so soundly while everything she had built with me was crumbling? How could she carry on like nothing was wrong when she was lying to me every single day? I turned away, my anger boiling over again. I needed more than this. I needed a final blow, something that would shatter their world the way they had shattered mine. And then, it hit me, Jenna's life revolved around her reputation. She prided herself on being the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect friend. What would happen if everyone knew the truth? If everyone saw her for what she really was? The next day, I started gathering every piece of evidence I could, texts, emails, photos. I printed everything out, put it all in a folder, and waited. I waited for the right moment, the perfect time to drop the bomb that would blow up Jenna's carefully crafted world. I wasn't going to confront her in private. No, I wanted this to be public, for everyone to see. In the meantime, I continued my routine, pretending that nothing was wrong. It was torture, seeing Jenna every day, hearing her talk about her plans, her friends, her work. I listened, I nodded, and I smiled, all while imagining the moment when it would all come crashing down around her. But Jenna wasn't my only target. George had to go down too, and I wasn't going to let him get away with just losing his business. I needed him to feel the humiliation, the pain, the shame. I needed him to lose everything. I arranged a meeting with one of my competitors, a guy named Greg who had been trying to edge in on my market for years. We met over drinks one afternoon, and I laid out the plan. "George's business is going to tank soon," I told Greg. "And when it does, I want you to take over. But I want to make sure he knows it's coming from me." Greg raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "I want you to offer him a job when his business goes under. But make sure he knows it's for a fraction of what he's making now. Humiliate him. Let him know that he's only getting by because of me." Greg smirked, clinking his glass against mine. "You've got yourself a deal." By the time I left that meeting, I felt a dark satisfaction settling over me. Everything was falling into place, and soon, both Jenna and George would know exactly what it felt like to lose everything. It was a week later when the pieces of my plan started coming together. Each day that passed, I felt the tension building inside me, a mix of anticipation and anger. I wanted them to pay, Jenna and George both, but I needed to make sure everything was perfect. Timing was everything. Jenna had no idea that I knew about the affair. She carried on with her life as if nothing had changed, slipping in and out of the house with that same fake smile, offering the same tired excuses whenever she came home late. I barely listened to her anymore, only nodding when she spoke. Every word out of her mouth was another lie, and every lie pushed me closer to the edge. George was the same, still sending me friendly texts, still cracking jokes whenever we crossed paths. It took everything in me to play along, to smile back and act like nothing was wrong. But inside, I was simmering, ready to explode. He had no idea what was coming. Neither of them did. The final step in my plan came into focus when Jenna mentioned an upcoming work event, some fancy party hosted by one of her clients. It was going to be a big deal, with everyone from her office attending. She casually invited me to come along, like she always did, even though we both knew I rarely went to her work events. This time, though, I accepted. "Oh, you want to come this time?" she asked, surprised, her eyes widening slightly. "I mean, that's great. It'll be fun. You'll get to meet some of my new colleagues." "I think it'll be good for us," I said, forcing a smile. "I've been so busy with work lately, I'd love to see you in action. Plus, it sounds like it'll be a fun night." Jenna seemed pleased, if not a little thrown off by my sudden interest. She went on about the party, talking about the venue, the guest list, and the dress she was planning to wear. I listened to every word, my mind already working through how I would play this. The night of the party arrived, and I dressed the part, suit, tie, polished shoes, the whole 9 yards. Jenna looked stunning in a sleek black dress that hugged her curves, her blonde hair falling perfectly around her shoulders. I couldn't help but admire how beautiful she looked, even though every glance at her reminded me of her betrayal. We arrived at the venue, an upscale ballroom downtown, and I followed Jenna inside. The place was packed with well-dressed guests, most of them people from her work. I recognized a few faces, mostly colleagues she had introduced me to in the past, but I wasn't interested in small talk tonight. I had other plans. As we mingled with the crowd, I kept an eye on Jenna. She was in her element, charming everyone with her smile and her effortless conversation. I watched as she drifted from one group to another, her laugh ringing out like music to their ears. But I wasn't fooled. I knew what lay underneath that perfect exterior. About an hour into the party, I slipped away, excusing myself to the restroom. Instead of heading to the bathroom, though, I made my way to a quiet corner of the ballroom, where I had stashed the folder. The folder that contained everything, every text, every email, every piece of evidence that proved what Jenna and George had been doing behind my back. I made sure everything was in order, then casually returned to the party. Jenna didn't notice me at first, she was too busy chatting with her boss. But as I approached, I caught her eye. She smiled, that same fake smile I'd grown so used to seeing. "Hey, there you are," she said, linking her arm through mine. "I was just telling Greg about you." "Sorry, got a little sidetracked," I replied, slipping the folder into my jacket pocket. "But I'm here now." We made small talk for a while, Jenna introducing me to more of her colleagues, each one praising her work ethic and how lucky I was to have such a dedicated wife. I nodded along, biting back the bitter taste in my mouth. If only they knew. Then, I spotted George. He was across the room, standing near the bar, laughing with a few other guys from Jenna's office. My blood boiled at the sight of him, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't lose control. Not yet. I waited for the right moment, watching him from a distance. He hadn't seen me yet, and that was good. I needed this to be a surprise. I excused myself from Jenna's side again, this time heading straight for George. He looked up as I approached, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Kurt, buddy. Didn't expect to see you here." "Yeah, thought I'd show up for once," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Can we talk for a minute? Somewhere quiet?" George glanced around, then nodded, a little confused. "Sure, man. What's up?" I led him to a side hallway, away from the noise of the party. Once we were alone, I pulled out the folder and handed it to him. George frowned, clearly not understanding what was going on. "What's this?" he asked, flipping open the folder. "Just take a look," I said, my voice cold. He scanned the first few pages, his expression changing from confusion to shock in an instant. The color drained from his face as he realized what he was holding. All the evidence of his affair with Jenna, every text, every incriminating photo, was laid out in front of him. "Kurt, George started, but I cut him off. "Save it," I said, stepping closer. "I know everything, George. Every lie. Every time you were with her. I've been watching you both for months." He stammered, trying to find the right words, but there was nothing he could say that would make this right. He had betrayed me, and now he was going to pay for it. "You think I didn't know?" I continued, my voice rising. "You think you could keep this from me forever? You've been fucking my wife behind my back for years, and you thought I wouldn't find out?" "Kurt, listen, I'm sorry, man. It just happened," George pleaded, his eyes wide with panic. "You're sorry?" I scoffed, shaking my head. "You're not sorry, George. You're only sorry because you got caught." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I could feel the rage bubbling up inside me, but I wasn't going to let it take over. "Not yet. This is just the beginning," I said, stepping back. "You're going to lose everything, George. Your business, your reputation, everything. And when you're standing in the wreckage of your life, you'll remember this moment." George's face was pale, his hands shaking as he clutched the folder. "Please, Kurt, don't do this. We can fix this. I'll stop seeing her. I'll do whatever you want." "It's too late for that," I said, turning to walk away. "I've already started." I left him standing there, his world crumbling around him, and made my way back to the ballroom. Jenna was still talking with her colleagues, blissfully unaware of what had just happened. But she wouldn't be for long. I waited until the party was in full swing, the music loud, the crowd buzzing with energy. Then I made my move. I walked up to Jenna, taking her hand in mine. She smiled up at me, surprised by the sudden affection. "Kurt, what are you?" she started, but I didn't let her finish. "I have something to show you," I said, pulling the folder out of my jacket. Her smile faltered as she looked down at the folder in my hand. She took it from me, her hands trembling as she opened it. I watched as her face changed, the color draining from her cheeks, her eyes widening in horror as she realized what she was holding. "Kurt. I can explain," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the party. "Don't bother," I said, my voice cold and unforgiving. "It's all there, Jenna. Every lie. Every secret. Everyone here is going to know what you've done." Her eyes filled with tears, her lower lip trembling as she tried to hold herself together. But there was no escaping this. Not anymore. I turned away from her, making my way to the stage at the front of the room. The DJ looked at me, confused, but I didn't care. I grabbed the microphone and turned to face the crowd, the room falling silent as everyone's eyes turned toward me. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice echoing through the room. "I think it's time we all learned a little something about Jenna and George." I watched as the realization spread across the room, saw the shock on their faces as they turned to look at Jenna, then at George, standing frozen in the back of the room. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The room went silent after my announcement. I could feel every eye on me, the weight of their stares pressing down like a lead blanket. Jenna stood frozen near the stage, her face pale, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. George, on the other side of the ballroom, looked like a man condemned, clutching the folder I had handed him just minutes earlier. Their worlds were crumbling, and for a brief moment, I felt a cold satisfaction. But that feeling didn't last. As the silence stretched on, a strange sensation crept over me. I had imagined this moment for weeks, played it over and over in my head. I had dreamed of the way Jenna and George would suffer, how their perfect little worlds would collapse. I had convinced myself that this public humiliation would heal me, that it would be the justice I needed. But standing there, microphone in hand, I didn't feel the triumph I had expected. Instead, I felt hollow. I watched as Jenna's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched the damning evidence. I could see the panic in George's face, the silent pleading for me to stop, to undo what had just been set into motion. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, the whispers spreading like wildfire, and I realized that I had just destroyed not only their lives, but my own as well. The weight of the moment hit me hard, knocking the wind out of me. I had thought this would bring me closure, but instead, it felt like I had torn open a wound that would never heal. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The betrayal had been theirs, yes, but now the devastation was mine too. And no matter what I did, there was no going back. Jenna finally broke the silence, her voice trembling as she stepped forward. "Kurt, please, we can talk about this." I shook my head. "There's nothing left to talk about, Jenna. It's over." Her tears spilled over, and she reached out to me, her fingers brushing against my arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." You didn't mean for this to happen?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You didn't mean to lie to me for years? You didn't mean to destroy our family?" Her face crumpled, and she fell to her knees, sobbing. The sight of her like that, broken and vulnerable, made my chest tighten. This wasn't the Jenna I had known for 14 years. This wasn't the woman I had loved, the mother of my child. But maybe she had been all along, and I just hadn't seen it. As I stood there, watching her fall apart, the anger that had fueled me for so long began to fade. All that was left was sadness, a deep, aching sadness that wrapped itself around my heart and refused to let go. I had wanted revenge, but now that I had it, it felt hollow. The satisfaction I had hoped for was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the other side of the room. People gasped and turned to look. George had shoved his way through the crowd and knocked over a table in his haste to leave. He stormed toward the exit, his face flushed, his fists clenched. In that moment, he looked more like a desperate man trying to escape than the cocky friend I once knew. I watched him go, but I didn't move. Let him run. It wouldn't change anything. Jenna's sobs grew louder, and I turned back to her. She was still on her knees, her face buried in her hands, shaking with every breath. I had wanted to see her broken, but now that I had, it didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it would. It just hurt. Everything hurt. I walked off the stage and knelt beside her, unsure of what I was doing. Maybe it was the memories of our life together, or maybe it was the weight of all the years we had spent trying to build something real. But for some reason, I couldn't just leave her there like that. "Jenna," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "Kurt, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never. I didn't know how to stop." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I know. But this can't be undone. We're done." She nodded, tears still streaming down her face. I know. For a moment, we just sat there, surrounded by the whispers and stares of everyone in the room. I could feel their judgment, their shock, but none of it mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was the broken woman in front of me and the shattered remains of the life we had built together. "I'll pack my things," Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I didn't want to be the one to say it, to end things officially, but I knew it had to be done. There was no coming back from this. As Jenna stood up, I saw the weight of the moment settle into her. She walked toward the exit, each step heavy with the knowledge that everything was over. The crowd parted for her, their eyes full of pity and judgment. I watched her go, feeling a strange emptiness fill the space she left behind. But as she reached the door, something happened that I hadn't expected. She stopped, her body going rigid. And then, without warning, she collapsed. At first, no one moved. The shock was too great, the moment too surreal. But then someone screamed, and people rushed toward her. I was frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced myself to move, running toward her, my mind racing with possibilities. "Jenna!" I shouted, dropping to my knees beside her. She didn't respond. Her face was pale, her body limp. My hands shook as I reached for her, pressing my fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. It was faint, too faint. "Someone call an ambulance!" I yelled, my voice cracking with panic. People scrambled, and I could hear the murmur of voices, the panic spreading through the room. But all I could focus on was Jenna. Her breathing was shallow, her lips tinged with blue. I had no idea what was happening, no idea what had caused this, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. They rushed to her side, pushing me away as they worked to stabilize her. I stood there, helpless, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched them work. I couldn't lose her. Not like this. But as they loaded her onto the stretcher and wheeled her out of the ballroom, I realized that I already had. Hours later, I sat in the hospital waiting room, my head in my hands. The doctor had come out once, telling me that Jenna had suffered a heart attack, likely brought on by the stress of everything that had happened. They were doing everything they could, but her condition was critical. I barely heard his words, my mind numb with shock. I had wanted revenge, but I never wanted this. I never wanted to break her like this. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the sterile walls of the hospital, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. The anger, the betrayal, the humiliation, it all seemed so small now, so insignificant. All that mattered was Jenna lying in that hospital bed, fighting for her life because of me. When the doctor finally came back, his face told me everything I needed to know. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "She's gone. Gone." The word echoed in my mind, a dull, painful thud that reverberated through my entire body. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I had destroyed her, and in the end, it had cost me everything. There was no revenge. No justice. Only grief. And it would stay with me for the rest of my life.